For the next 45 minutes, our panel will be discussing data breaches and crisis communication, including how to best manage data breaches within a global pandemic, requirements to notify customers, incident management, and the challenges of this within a worldwide remote working culture. So now I would like to bring to the stage the always affable and insightful Peter Dorrington, founder of Exemplify. If you'd like to turn on your camera, please, Peter.
Hi, thanks, Robin.
Thank you for coming. Always a pleasure to have you. I'm going to pass the wheel over to you to introduce yourself and the panelists and really get this show on the road.
Thank you. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Peter and I'm the founder of Exemplify Consulting. And that's a small firm that specializes in experience management. But you're not here to hear from me, although I will be your moderator today. But from our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order by their first name. So Harry Boget, over to you. Would you mind turning your camera on and joining us?
Hi, Peter. How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks, Harry.
That's good.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, well, I've got an interesting background. I come from an IT background, but I got a bit tired of the technical stuff, and then I started doing things like service transition, business analyst. And in the last 4 years, basically, I've been involved in data protection, GDPR to be precise, and information security. Currently work for an organization called SmartSafe. I'm the principal consultant in data protection and cybersecurity. And also at the same time, I am the secretary of an association called the EADPP, which is an association, European Association of Data Protection Professionals. It's an open group. Anybody can join if you're working in the data protection space. So it's my pleasure to be here to discuss things around data breaches and all that. Hoping to give the little insight and experience that I've acquired in the last 4 years.
Great, thank you, Harry. And now for our second panelist, I'd like to introduce Polina Whitaker. So Polina, would you mind putting your camera on? Harry, we love to see you. Leave your camera on.
Thanks very much, Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm a partner in the law firm Morgan Lewis. I work in London, and I'm one of the co-leaders of our global privacy and cybersecurity practice. I lead the international team, and we've got a whole team of amazing specialists sitting around the world, so very much of a global practice. I'm really excited to be on this amazing panel to discuss some of the real challenges of managing data breaches. I'm sure we're all familiar with the inadvertent and then the really horrific cyber attacks that have, certainly been ramping up, and the current pandemic and the lockdown has been a really big challenge, but certainly exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. So I'm really excited to share some of those insights and experiences with you all.
Great, and we're looking forward to hearing them. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our third panelist, Tanya Joyce, to join us. So Tanya, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on.
Hi.
Yay.
So I'm Tanya Joyce. I work in the B2B sector of Centrica, British Gas, as a data privacy champion, leader of a small team of data privacy champions, and as the lead data governance manager for the B2B sector as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Tanya. So I just want to remind everybody that we are recording this session, and hopefully the recording will be made available later on to those of you attending. And also, if you have questions, then please submit them through the chat function in your window. We've had a lot of advanced questions from our guests. So I'm going to start with those, but if you see me looking off to one side, it's because I'm checking that chat window. So the first question then. In the dash to digital, a lot of companies have scrambled to move to digital or virtual platforms as they've struggled to deal with social distancing and the ability to still work. Does that present any new or increased dangers to data protection or security? And for this one, I'll start with Harry. So Harry, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think the rush to today's digital working remotely, I think it has introduced actually the security part of that, where organizations were not prepared in terms of looking at their remote working policy from home, putting things in place to protect data. And what you inevitably get during this period is high phishing. And if you have not trained your staff in regard to IT security, how to deal with on suspicious email, the danger is they will click on what they might be expecting is a genuine email. So prior to this, I think what organizations should have done was to kind of train their staff, kind of an awareness, security awareness and data protection awareness, and also people handling personal data to train them on how to handle personal data. If you're not sure of an email, don't click on it, or if you're not sure, then you have to double check. So I think the situation brought organizations to just quickly get everybody working from home without preparing from that. So organizations are trying to do kind of what I would call a catch-up now to bridge those gaps that were there before the pandemic came in.
Great. Tanya, I'll hop over to you. So what are your thoughts? Have we got any new or increased dangers?
I think it really does depend on the sector you're in and the sort of scale of the business. Where I work for a very large organization, we already had quite a lot of the virtual working policies in place, and we had a lot of robust stuff from the InfoSec perspective. But where I've seen the most risk is in our attempts to make things easier for our customers during this time. So a lot of teams will, in that dash to digital, try and forego some of the policies and procedures that are put in place so that we can make sure that we are remaining compliant with data protection legislation. And they might not see the necessity of, for example, filling out a privacy impact assessment prior to launching whatever activity it is, because it's so important that we get these services out there for our customers in the middle of this pandemic. So it's finding that balance between being quick off the mark when it comes to how we respond to this absolutely unprecedented situation and making sure that we do still remain compliant.
Okay, thank you. How about Polina? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Absolutely agree with Tanya and Harry. It's very much what we're seeing with, with some of the unfortunate incidents that our clients have suffered. One of the things that has really come out is that, whilst everyone's working in sort of office spaces, in the main, in a sort of, a professional services type firm, a lot of people are sort of in the main working, on office space and in secure networks. When everyone has sort of been dispersed and is working remotely, we've seen our clients find that their staff are using unsecured networks. The devices that they're using haven't been, checked by IT, and they're working outside of the, the infrastructure. And that's been a real challenge, as I totally echo what Tanya was saying, in the sort of the need to achieve customers' requests and preferences. There's been a real sort of divergence from, from IT security systems and just networks. All the various video conferencing platforms that are available are, amazing, but not all of them are super secure as, some of our clients' own networks. And one of the things we've also found, there's been a real sort of challenge, is that whilst people are not working in typically an office or a site-based environment, if something does happen to them or their device, they don't have the ability to just go down the, down the corridor and speak to IT or pick up the phone. It's not quite the same. So there's been some real issues with how to handle an incident once it's occurred.
And I think that raises actually a point that came up with one of those pre-prepared questions when people were asking about what are the dangers of using your own device. We've had bring your own device within an office environment for quite a while, but from my own experience, I've come across people who are, you've said, using unsecured networks, domestic networks, using their own technology to get on board. Has that presented any special cases that people need to be aware of?
So we've certainly seen a huge sort of uptick in, these unsecured networks and unsecured devices being used. And one of the sort of interesting things that came across my desk a couple of weeks ago was somebody who had been working remotely whilst juggling homeschooling requirements and had given his device to his daughter, I think, to connect on a Zoom call for school. And she had sort of continued to to go through various sort of emails and things, and something happened that shouldn't have happened, compromising that client's data. So that was something that was obviously embarrassing for the individual, but needed to be resolved. So that, the increased challenges of unsupervised children using devices applies regardless of the security of the network.
Okay, and how about Tanya or Harry?
Yeah, I think the danger you find there, like Paulina just said, is if the device that you're using, first of all, at home, because you will be connecting not to the network, but connecting to your local network, and your network might not be secure. And I mean, those attackers might come through your own unsecured network, get into your laptop and do some other damages. And also, if we look at you working from home, if you're not prepared, you have your kids around and they're using your devices, it could pose a high, not just embarrassing moment. It could also provide danger. Also, if that laptop doesn't have that option, if you have, say, there are some organizations that give their workers, they give them the administration right, so meaning you can download the executable. And once you click on the executable file, it could just sit down dormant in that network because you're already connected to the corporate network. It just sits down there and just basically start mutating around it could be for years. Or a year, 6 months, without the IT knowing, without nobody knowing, until it's already too late. So there's always danger in terms of those things. That is why IT need to do constant, maybe penetration testing, constant check on machines to make sure that they actually having the security and the necessary patches in place.
Cool. And Tanya, just to finish off on this point, what about you? Your thoughts about bring your own device or have your own device?
Well, I completely agree with everything that Harry and Paulina have said already. It's not something that has been a major concern for us because we have a really robust team, to the point that it took me 2 weeks to actually get access to this system so that I could even do this call. But it is really, really important, if nothing else, to give your staff the access to basic education about information security and their own personal data security, because a lot of people won't necessarily think about how something can affect the business, but if you can explain to them how it can affect them personally, then they're much more likely to be able to understand it and to try and follow that advice. And that's something that we've seen in my team, both from the perspective of getting people to be GDPR compliant and also sort of information security compliant as well.
Okay, thank you. So I've just been looking at the chat and we've already got some good questions that I think are anticipating some of what we want to get to in a moment. So I'll leave those for the time being. But there are some good suggestions as well. And a nice point from Richard about, we always think about these two environments, home and work, as being different. I guess they're not, but they serve different purposes. We relax at home, we work at work, and now we're kind of trying to do a bit of the both. So also some recommendations about frameworks to use. Not being an expert in the field, I would leave that for people like Harry, who is, to be able to take those. But I have another question then. So we're leading on from this. Given that there is a lot of virtualization and a lot of businesses just have had to introduce remote working and remote businesses, what should be the focus and strategy or mechanisms that we adopt for this largely virtual world we find ourselves in at the moment? And I'm going to start with Paulina. So what would be your point of view? What should we be thinking about now, specifically in this new strange we all find ourselves in?
Yeah, well, I think the importance of training is really magnified in this, virtual remote environment. It was always super important, as far as I'm concerned, for data protection compliance. It was always something that I was really, really keen that my clients really understood early on when preparing for frameworks like the GDPR and other frameworks around the world. The importance of knowing.
I think lightning struck Paulina, so I'm going to hand over to Tanya for a moment.
Something goes wrong. I have
Paulina, we lost you for a moment.
normally it's a Friday.
We've lost her completely.
I've lost her again.
Tanya, would you mind picking up the ball then? So, what should we be thinking about in terms of strategy and focus and mechanisms for this remote working environment?
Yeah, definitely. I think based on what I could hear Paulina was saying, I think we were probably along the same lines there. But from my perspective, the most important thing is making sure you've got those tools in place. One thing that we've found very, very useful is having a virtual knowledge hub that we can easily and regularly update. So within maybe a couple of weeks of the business going virtual, my team and I had set up a specific page in this virtual knowledge hub called COVID-19 and GDPR, which had some advice for customer-facing teams who were finding that they were getting contact from customers saying things like, "You're working on an unsecured network and we think that's a breach of GDPR," or "I want access to my information and I want it in the post," and things like that that really in this environment we can't do, or that there is a bit of misinformation about. So having that there for people has been really, really helpful, because it's meant that we're dealing with less of the same questions over and over again, and they have the tools to help our customers better, but we've also been adding information that's relevant to them in their home lives, because everybody's stuck at home right now. Home and work are the same thing, right?
Yeah. So, Paulina, we lost you for a moment there. So we heard a bit about
dip
training
into when they need the support.
Yeah.
Means of contacting you as well is really, really important.
Thanks, Tanya. Sorry, I think I spoke over you for a moment there. Paulina, we lost you halfway through, I think.
Yes. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. It was almost as if people had sort of overheard me talking about this particular incident. So we had a client who, one of their staff members had a cybersecurity attack, and there was a ransom demand. And without sort of being able to, as I say, walk down the corridor and speak to IT and say what's happened, he paid the ransom, thinking that this would help sort of unlock, his system. So what the real importance of what to do if your data has been compromised or if your data's lost. As Tanya was just saying, we now have no division between work and home. So people are working in environments where they're either sharing a house maybe or an apartment, and so papers are sort of, not safely and securely stored. So that's sort of hard copies. They're getting up from the table, making themselves a cup of tea or whatever, or going to the door, and their laptop is there, perhaps with other people around who don't work at the same organization. So a real sort of, increase in the risk of personal data being compromised in that regard as well. Knowing what to do, how to keep data secure, and knowing what to do when something goes wrong is, super, super important.
Yeah, I can see that. It must be awful if you're working from home, as you say, and you haven't got that immediate access to somebody when it goes all horribly wrong on you. Harry, any last words before we go on to the next?
I think it's just to add a few that what Paulina and Tanya have said is like a case I've had a case somebody as well in regard to working from home and getting access. I mean, he clicked on the phishing email, and then they started asking for ransom and stuff like that. But he was very clever. He didn't pay that, but contacted the IT department immediately, and then they started working on the backstage to remediate that issue. But going forward, organizations should always have a backup and a backup, so to speak. So if one is compromised, then you have a backup that is not online. So you are certain that one is not online. It's something that has not been compromised. So you can easily just bring that one up and just leave the other one that has been compromised.
Cool. I think I'm going to change the screensaver now to the keep calm and carry on. Don't panic is the first thing. So I'm going to take a question now from the chat. It was interesting because we've talked about Dash to Digital and how businesses are desperately trying to find ways to service their customers and make life easy for customers. And they're often doing this in a DevOps environment, or where they're trying to introduce live data into testing. Is that ever acceptable, or should we be using masking technologies or pseudonymization to deal with this? Is it acceptable to use live data in a testing environment with such a compressed timescale to go operational? And this time I'll go to Harry first, and then I'll go to you, Tanya.
I think it is never advisable to use live data in your development environment. That is me coming from an IT background and all that. So because I spoke with somebody today asking question, say they use data. This company is based outside the EU. The first question I asked, so if you're based outside the EU, how do you get those data to do your development, to do your testing? And they say yes, but they don't touch our data that's in the UK. They just use a kind of a mass data to do their dev up, and then once it's certified with that, they can bring it up live to the live environment. So it's never always advisable to use live data, because one, you'll be breaching GDPR to start with, and some other regulations that are out there that you'll be breaching. So it's never advisable to do that. Either you're going to pseudonymize it or do something to it, but not the live data itself.
Okay, thank you. Tanya, what about you? What do you think about this?
Well, like Harry, I come from a sort of IT tech background, specifically in data management. So I completely agree. You should never, ever use live data in the test environment, because if something goes wrong with your test, you're going to cause yourself problems. Speaking from experience, but I can't really divulge any more than that, unfortunately. But yeah, don't use test data in a don't use live data in a test environment. It's asking for trouble.
And Polina, I'm teeing you up for a stinking question in a moment, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think we have a consensus. Don't do it. Very unlikely from a legal perspective. There'll be a lawful processing ability to use live data that hasn't been completely anonymized. You're unlikely to be getting consent or to have given notice that the data is going to be used in this way. And if you're using legitimate interest, that you obviously need to go through the legitimate interest assessment and work out whether, in fact, it would be expected to the individual to use their data in this way. And if not, don't do it. Then I suspect you're probably unlikely to meet those, the balancing test.
Thank you. And I can understand why the question was asked and why some people are feeling this way, because that dash to digital, we're trying to do everything in a compressed timescale. And I think that what we're saying is you have to still take the legitimate steps you need to take, even in a high pressure environment. So this is the question I think will be quite an interesting one. So, and I'm going to start with you, Polina. What do you think about, what's the practical benchmark for a breach that requires contacting data subjects? Or what threshold should we consider it as being a breach and that we need to do something? So, and try not to give the legal answer, because I think we could be here all day.
It's a really interesting question, and we've had so many conversations with the ICO and other regulators across Europe about whether a precise incident actually meets the notifiable thresholds to report to the individuals. And I think the lessons learned in the last sort of 2 and a bit years are, if it's anything to do with their sort of core privacy, so if it's their home address together with other contact details, that's certainly a factor towards notifying. But if that's, if it's just an email address, probably not. If it's their passport biometric data and it couldn't be retrieved, it couldn't be deleted, yes. If it could be deleted immediately, or we've got confirmation from the recipient who inadvertently got it, we've had consensus across Europe that is not notifiable to the individual. I have to say that surprised me, but that was the consistent regulator view, even if it was a passport, copy of a passport. Anything to do with credit cards that was more than, just the last 3 digits. So the actual full length of the credit card number, definitely reportable. And anything that, sort of maybe in terms of summarizing, anything that would actually be useful to the individual to take steps to do things like change passwords, so any password information, of course, or other steps to protect their privacy should be notified to the individual. It's that sort of in the round constitutes high risk, high risks for the individual. If they can take steps to remediate that risk, then you should notify.
Great. I'm going to go to Tanya for final word on this question, then we'll move on to another one.
Oh, in all honesty, I don't think there's anything that I can add from what Paulina's already said. Not massively helpful, I'm afraid.
It's okay. But in that case, Harry, do you have anything? Because I've got another stinking question I'd like to.
I think more is more also has to do with the volume of those data that has been breached. For example, I've had a case in such where maybe about 100 letters were sent to the wrong individual. But looking at what was inside that email, that letter is just I think I'm going to give away the company now. It's just a name that is just name, which doesn't necessarily identify that person immediately. So we're looking at when we looked at the balancing act to say, is it actually did we actually compromise the individual's right and freedom? We found out that no, that it was not. So therefore, we didn't report it to the ICO, but we took other measures to make sure that didn't happen again. So exactly what is in that what has been breached plays a heavy role. If it was sensitive data, then automatically we have to report it to the supervisory authority.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to ask that difficult question. Difficult because I don't even know how to begin to understand this one. So there are lots of methodologies for dealing with data incidents, but are there any industry-leading or robust approaches? And the one that the person asking the question has said is, for example, the ENISA. So I'm not aware of that. Oh, Paulina, you're nodding your head. I might well come to you.
Yeah, ENISA. So that's the European sort of framework. And look, I think the guidance that they issue is very useful. It's can be sort of quite academic and quite sort of theoretical in some regards, but it's certainly, it's designed to sort of be consistent in terms of the framework. So I think it's definitely a useful start. I mean, there's a couple of things. Obviously, most countries have got their own sort of security infrastructure. We have Cyber Essentials here as a sort of voluntary certification mechanism to show that you've got good security standards. But in terms of I think maybe the question was in terms of the sort of standard about sort of how to assess reporting or not. I haven't seen anything that's consistent. Very much depends on the facts of the incident. As Harry was saying, how many people are affected, the content of the data that's affected or compromised, how long it went on for is really important. If it was sustained, if it was repetitive, or if it was a one-off, that was remediated very quickly. And then remediation steps. One thing that we've really learned over the 2 years is that the steps that are taken to remediate the incident are really important to determining whether or not it's notifiable.
Yeah. And do either Harry or you, Tanya, have anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't have much. I think Paulina said all.
So I'm going to ask perhaps a little bit more of a straightforward question now. So in practice, when a breach happens and it affects multiple people, what would be best practice in how we should attempt to contact those that have been affected? So, for example, if we don't have completely up-to-date email address data, so is there any guidance you can share there about what would be acceptable or best practice for how you reach out and contact people affected by a breach?
Well, in that case, to start with, if you don't have the right email of the people's data that you're holding, so meaning you are already not complying with some of the parts of GDPR in terms of accuracy, so that will be an issue. First of all, it depends. I would say it's going to depend from the organization to organization how they want to communicate. They will have their communication plan in place to say how they want to communicate. I think the most easy one is to send out a letter to notify those that have been involved in the data breach, in the data, or the field that are in that set of data that have been breached, to inform them either by email or letters. I've been in that situation where I've got an email from the organization, and at the same time, the next 2 days, I was getting a letter to say, okay, we had this incident. This is what we think they have breached. Possibly they've not got into the sensitive data because we keep this set of data here and we keep the other data there. So the part that there was a breach possibly is the one that has your email address and your name, but the other part where your credit card and things are on a separate server has not been touched. So it's communicating that to the data subject to put that person at rest, because you don't want to hear on the news that, oh, your one provider that you're using has been breached and they've not even told you anything. You've not heard anything from them. It gives you panic to say, oh, is my data already in the hands of the wrong guys? And they will start trying to implement, or rather try to carry out fraud in my name, maybe applying for credit cards and the rest. So I think it's going to differ from organization to organization how they communicate. I wouldn't say there's a best way or there's a worst way. Communication is always good, basically.
Okay. Thanks, Harry. And Tanya, how about you?
Yeah, I'd say that it really does depend on A, the organization you work for, and B, what the breach is, because obviously if the breach involves email addresses, you don't really want to be emailing the people that have been impacted by it. As my team, we'd probably prefer to email a notification out purely because we've got more likelihood of actually getting it to the person that's been affected. But paper mail is still useful. So yeah, it really does depend on the organization and what exactly has happened. It's something you need to treat on a case-by-case basis, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Polina, did you have anything to add?
Only absolutely agree with Harry and Tanya. Only to sort of add, if it constitutes a mass data breach, I certainly find that clients, get huge amounts of brownie points by getting ahead of the message. So putting something on their website before the ICO comes out and puts it on their website to say we've been notified and we're investigating, because that is literally the worst, order of events to occur. We found clients who have found it super helpful to set up dedicated phone lines. Often, in terms of sort of capacity of manning those phone lines, it is not possible for the organisation to do it themselves. So third parties are out there and are able to offer that sort of, support helpline service, which definitely is going to be important, and obviously make it a free phone number.
Excellent, good advice. So I think there's a limit to how far we could be expected to go, but we should make some best endeavours to contact people. So I've got another question here. So this is an interesting one. I'm not even sure myself how I would deal with this. So to what extent can an organisation that's part of a multinational group assume that the UK legislation is consistent and in line with GDPR and EU legislation, for example? Is it sufficient, or do we need to be thinking about specific measures for multinationals? And I'll start with you this time, Polina.
So, I mean, most of my practice and my team's practice is involving a multinational in one way or another, and often it's about trying to achieve consistency across, each of the entities. And it's so hard to achieve. So we've got clients who have gone both ways, those who want to very much have a domestic approach. So each country in each different territory, each organisation in each territory takes a slightly different compliance approach. And then we've got clients who've gone the other way and just made things very consistent across the world, even though in the US, for example, there's no sort of, entrenched ability to make subject access requests or that sort of thing. So it definitely depends on a couple of things. One is the risk appetite. Two is the sort of cultural conversation around data compliance, data protection compliance. And three, what message they want to send both to staff and to customers, in terms of how important is the data, how important is the data as a practical sort of place to start. Perhaps actually the data isn't going to be terribly important in terms of what it is. If it's a B2B, it might well not be. But yeah, it definitely depends on all those factors. So far, we've seen the GDPR is very much the leading framework. So if an organisation complies with the GDPR around the world, that's pretty much going to be good to go for now. We are definitely keeping a watch and wait, and that's obviously subject to localization laws in countries like Russia and China.
Okay, thank you. And Tanya, what about you? Have you got any thoughts about being part of an international group?
Yeah, so the approach we've taken is to try and sort of keep things as uniform as possible. So as much as Centrica does have locations in the States, in various parts of Europe, and obviously in the UK and Ireland, we all kind of stick to roughly the same principles. So we're all technically GDPR compliant. And from what I understand, because I don't have a view of every single unit's data, we're all processing information that's from our sister companies and places like that. So it makes sense for us to be GDPR compliant across the board.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd recommend it for others too.
Thanks, Tanya. And finally, over to you, Harry. Any thoughts on this about being part of an international group and harmonisation?
Yeah, I think being part of an international group, I think the basic line, what Tanya was saying, is to have an harmonized process in place where anything that happens in one organization, technically, we'll say 90-95% is going to happen across that multinational organization. But having said that, I've worked for an organization where they're actually real multinational, but the processes were disjointed in the sense that different organizations, different of those entities have different way of processing those data. And what I was trying to bring in at that time was to make sure everybody had a central point where, yes, you might be operating as an entity, but in terms of data protection and security process, because you're accessing one network, you should have one process and one kind of ways of working throughout the organization, especially if you have binding corporate rules, for example. It will help a long way to bring all of them together.
Great, thank you. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you each to share a story of either good or best or worst practice in how to deal with a breach. Just a couple of things coming out from the chat. The live data one seems to have stimulated a bit of conversation about, I guess we all feel the pressure to do that, when you certainly don't have test data. Also, one just came up just now. We need to remind people this isn't just about an online experience. You can have offline and in-person breaches as well. So that's a good point. So what I'd like to do now is, because we're coming towards the close, is ask each of you, and I'm going to start with Tanya, without naming names, could you give an example of either the best or worst example of how to deal with a breach that you've seen? So Tanya, would you mind starting off? What's one that struck you, that stuck in your mind? Is that, well, I'm never going to do that again, or I'll absolutely do it that way if it ever happens to us?
So I'm afraid you may have to pass to someone else while I think about this, because I've just seen a comment in the chat for worst, please. And
Bad news.
I don't mean to brag, but my team are actually very, very good at dealing with data breaches, so we don't have a worst case scenario that I can think of off the top of my head.
I'll give you a moment to peruse the menu before we can make a choice. So how about you, Polina? In your world, you must have seen some absolute stinkers or some absolutely brilliant cases of handling a breach.
Yeah. The one a few weeks ago where my client's employee paid the ransom without telling anyone, thinking he could fix it himself, was definitely up there with the stinkers. But in terms of a really well handled breach, again, Friday afternoon call, usual thing. But they came to us first, thank goodness, without having to sort of spend too much time. The incident response team got mobilized over the weekend. It was absolutely amazing. We had done a penetration testing case study for them, an online desktop exercise for them about a year before. So actually everyone was really well coordinated, and thankfully no one had moved on. All the team members we trained were the team members that were mobilized that weekend. They got everything sorted out. What they did over the weekend is managed to get hold of someone in PR. And so what we did by, I think, the end of Monday, beginning of Tuesday, is they issued a press statement because it was a public breach. They issued a press statement, got ahead of it. By Tuesday, they had a phone line, they had a dedicated page on the website, and they'd already spoken to the ICO. So well within the 72 hours, it was amazing, actually. The only example I can think of that actually sort of meets all of the points that we had covered off in training, that was absolutely brilliant.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Harry? Best or the worst you've come across?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if we'll classify that as a worst data breach communication, where the breach has also gone into kind of a department in the organization noticed that breach first, but they sat on it for about 3 days, 4 days, 3.5 days, and then inform the data protection team so that they can start working on it, or informing IT. And the manager of that department, I think it was more like, I would say maybe she thinks her ego is being trampled upon if she says it happened in my department. But the thing is that we have to tell them that breach can happen anywhere. It can happen in the best setup, in terms of the best security you put in place. Breach can still happen. It's just you notifying the responsible team to start dealing with those data, i.e. IT and data protection. They could have stopped the network, take off that machine out of the network, first of all, to start with, so that it doesn't spread. But when you leave it for that 3-4 days, then you are already doing damages to the organization. I think that would be one I would say that I've had as an experience.
Great, thank you. And Tanya, do you still feel that you're watching us?
So in terms of real humdingers, I'm going to have to go outside of my specific world. But I vaguely remember reading an article about, I think it was a games company who published a load of their customers' information on their website by accident. And when they were informed about it, they doubled down instead of actually going, okay, yes, we made a mistake, we're really sorry. They released some sort of press release which tried to lay the blame at somebody else's door, and it got very messy very quickly. But as it was stateside, I don't think it really went anywhere, as these things tend to do, unfortunately. But from a best practice perspective, from a really good one, I and my team have been working very, very hard to cultivate a culture within our business that people can come to us if they think something has happened. And we had somebody who had accidentally emailed some information to the wrong person, and they came straight to us within seconds of sending this email and said, I think I've made a mistake. Am I going to get fired? Obviously, the answer to that is no, but we gave them some support and training, and we helped them mitigate the risk and contact the customer in the correct way to make sure that everything was resolved appropriately. But yeah, it's really, really important. And I know this isn't necessarily what was being asked, but it's really, really important to make sure that you do have that kind of culture. Because if people don't feel comfortable coming to you about issues, then they won't. And that's when you get your really bad data breaches.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. We've run out of time. We could talk for ages about this, particularly bad news. Bad news sells, and I always find those interesting. So I just want to recap with a couple of points, which I'm going to take away from this. Yeah, we've got some new risks about remote working, and particularly in things like unsecured networks and using your own devices. And I think we need training and knowledge bases to inform people. It's always better to get ahead of the problem than try and wait to see whether it goes away. So if the worst does happen, that non-blame culture, where that's appropriate, is a good thing. I think that even in an environment where we're all trying to move quickly to deal with a changing situation, we still need to be aware that we are exposed to risk, that data is still sensitive. And I think that we need to have a separate conference about the whole live data issue. Yeah, I can see the temptation to do it and the pressure that we're in. But with that, I'm afraid we have reached the end of our time. That just flew by. So I'd like to thank Harry, Paulina, and Tanya for joining me today for this conversation and this panel. I found it an education. I'm now going to go away and lock down all of the IT in my house and take my kids' phones away from them. And I'd like to thank the Executive Leaders Network for inviting us all to take part. And with that, I'm going to hand back, I think, to Robin, just to close out for the day.
I'm slightly terrified. Thank you so much, Pierre. Thanks to all. Really informative. It was great to hear your thoughts and your advice. From the chat, it sounds like it's been helpful to a lot of our delegates as well.